If you look around this area, you'll see mainly Baptist churches. There are also Methodist churches. The Baptists are, of course, the great majority of them around here. A lot of them today don't say Baptist anymore, but they are. And if you look around this area also, you will see differences in those Baptist churches. A lot of them now are going to what's called contemporary, and they have stage performances during church, and they sway their hands and carry on like that. And a lot of the ones that don't, a lot of ones still don't. But I wanted us to think about why are there so many Baptist churches, why are there so many Methodist churches, and why the churches have gone the way they've gone. And it all started back before we became our own country. It started in the middle part of the 1700s when we were still colonies of Great Britain. And I think that in order to understand what's going on today, it did just not happen. It came from going down in a path. Now, in the 1600s, it became known as the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. And historians mark that when the thinking of Europeans came out of the Middle Ages and into what we consider the modern world. The Middle Ages was full of superstition, mysticism, and the supernatural. In the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment, all of that was rejected. The Middle Ages was also the time of feudalism, where people were ruled by a class of nobility. And in the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, that was rejected. And so when you got up to the 1700s, people were rebelling against feudalism. They wanted the freedoms to express and have their own ideas and live the way they wanted. They rejected mysticism and the supernatural, and reason, logic, and using your mind became popular. In this climate, in the early 1700s, the idea developed that there is no spiritual realm, that the physical realm, the earth, the things that we see, is all there is. There is no spiritual realm behind anything, and that the world operates solely on natural laws, which you can use your power of thinking to understand. And there also developed the belief that God is not a personal being like we think of God. In the 1700s, the idea developed that God is more of a force or a principle. They did not deny the existence of God, but they said that God is not a personal being like we think of. God is a force. They began to talk about God in abstracts, like the organizing principle of the universe, the ground of existence. And these are abstracts. They're not talking about an entity. They're talking about an abstract force. Now, this was a widely held belief in Christianity in the 1700s, and it is a widely held belief today among many mainline Christians such as Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and Lutherans, although they want to be. But this way of looking at God was called deism. It pictures God not as an entity of being, but as a force or a principle. And that was the religion of many of the people in America in the mid-1700s. And this led to a decline in moral living. You can imagine that it would. If there is no higher power that you'll ever have to answer for, you can do whatever you want to and get by with it. As long as you don't get caught by somebody, you can do whatever you want to and get by with it. You're never going to have to answer for anything. You can do whatever you want to do. As long as you can get by with it here and people don't find out about it, go for it. You can do it. If you sin, so what? As long as nobody finds out about it, Who cares? And this created a challenge for Christianity. It led to a decline in morality. And also, people were saying there is no spiritual, there is no God, there's nothing but here and now and what we can see. It made Christianity unnecessary, superfluous. It was outmoded. And so in the mid-1700s, Christianity seemed to be on the way out. And with good reason. A lot of the Christianity back then was rote. You just went and watched while the priests did something, and you may have said the same prayers every week or the same scriptures, but you basically just watched while the priest did something. Church attendance declined. People became less interested in Christianity. It was dry. It was boring. It was outmoded. But when you look at it, people were getting dry, boring stuff from enlightenment in the age of reasoning also, because they were emphasizing logic and thinking. There was no room for feelings or emotion. But then, in the mid-1700s, something started among Presbyterians in the northern colonies. It was the idea that religion should be about feelings and emotions. Christianity should make you feel something. It should produce some kind of emotion in you. You should feel God in your life. A new style of preaching developed. It was a preaching that was designed to appeal to the emotions, to work you up. They said, look, don't pay attention to these people that say God is not involved in the world. Don't pay any attention to these people that say there's nothing but the physical world. Don't pay any attention to people that say there's no higher power that will hold you accountable. There is a spiritual realm, and when you die, you're going to go there. You're going to be facing God, and God's not going to be pleased with you. He's going to be mad at you because of the things you've done, and He's going to punish you. And so they developed an animated, theatrical style of preaching, and they would describe in minute detail the horrors of hell. And they would say, unless you shape up, that's going to be your fate for all eternity. They told you what a horrible sinner you were, how despicable you are, what filth you are in the sight of God, how you commit terrible sins every day, and God is just boiling over with anger, looking forward to the day when you can stand before Him and He'll finally get back at you. It had its desired result. It scared people to death. It was something never before seen in Christianity. That had never happened before. Working people up into a frenzy of fear. You're filthy. You're a sinner. And God's going to make you pay for it all. He's seen it all. And you're going to pay. And so here you are. You're back in the mid-1700s. And you hear all these preachers telling you that. On the other hand, though, you hear what the Enlightenment is telling you, the age of reason. They're telling you, hey, there ain't no such thing as that stuff. That stuff's just a bunch of malarkey. There's nothing like that. There's no spiritual realm. There's no God as a being. You're never going to stand before anybody and have to answer for anything. They say, just think, just think, just think. But the preachers were saying, don't you feel it? See, on one side they were saying, just think. On the other side they were going to say, don't you feel it? Don't you feel it in your heart? Don't you feel it in your heart what a horrible sinner you are? And you did feel something. You really did. And so maybe you better listen to the preachers. And people did listen to them in droves. And this was the beginning of what was known as the Great Awakening. Revival-type services were held all over the country, many of them outdoors. where fiery preachers would preach emotionally charged sermons designed to work you up and create an emotional response. And the sermons were designed by a formula. First, they would convince you that you are a sinner and were going to face horrible penalties from God. Second, they would convince you the only way out was to throw yourself on God's mercy. And third, once you had done that, what a great relief you would have. What a great relief. I'm no longer going to hell. I'm no longer going to burn for eternity. So you see, they scared you, they gave you a way out, and once you accepted that, it was a great relief. And that same thing would be done over and over and over at every service. You could throw yourself on the mercy of God and the fear would be gone. What a relief. It was like being pulled out of a burning house just before it collapsed. And it was all designed to do that. They developed it into an art form. People would swoon, pass out, go into hysterics. You see, appeals to emotions always work. That's why you see so many advertisements with dogs in them. I told one, I said, any politician that I see with a dog in their advertisements, I'm not voting for. I don't have anything against dogs. I like dogs. But the fact of it is, these people with these dogs, these advertisements, they're not doing it because they like dogs. They're doing it to create an emotional response. The pharmaceutical commercials have dogs in them. Not that the pills and shots are for dogs, but dogs create an emotional response in people, and that's why they're in advertisements. And so the preachers had hit on one of the great principles of marketing: appeal to people's emotions. In fact, some people consider the Great Awakening as the first major marketing success in this country. They went out on the streets and marketed a certain brand of Christianity, and they did it by appealing to the emotions. It was much different than what people saw in church. Rather than listening passively to a minister drone on and on in a sermon, people actively participated. They groaned and shouted and jumped around, and they displayed emotions. Now, at first, to a large extent, this Great Awakening revival movement bypassed churches. And the preachers were largely itinerant preachers. They weren't official ministers of a church. They just traveled the country preaching in different places. And while the regular church services held in churches were not attracting hardly anyone, these meetings were full of people. And you know what happened? You get any kind of fad going right now, and I'll guarantee you there's going to be a Baptist and Methodist church in Shelby doing it within 2 weeks. Nobody follows fads like churches. So the churches began to notice, and some churches began adopting this revivalistic style of emotional preaching, and people started coming. Everybody wanted to get in on the act. But there's another thing that's true also about churches. If you try to change something, some people ain't going to like it. And that's what happened then. In general, it was the younger people who were attracted to the emotional stuff, and the older people wanted to leave it like it was. And these established ministers that were back then ministers were seen as part of the upper crust of society. And they were part of the in crowd back then. They were part of that group of society that thinks they're better than everybody else. And here come these itinerant preachers in and have no education or something. They're drawing a huge crowd, and here comes some snooty-nosed preacher standing up the pulpit. He's got 5 people out there. He ain't going to like it. So the ministers didn't like it. They didn't appreciate it when these preachers came into town and started telling people stuff different from what they could hear in church. They saw it as a threat to their authority and their position. And so a rift developed. Those who liked the stuff that was emotional and carried on was called New Lights, L-I-G-H-T-S. Those who wanted to remain with the old style were called Old Lights. And the New Lights went on the offensive against the Old Lights and said that you people are not really Christians and your churches should be done away with. You don't have the Spirit and all this, that, and the other. But the Old Lights said, well, how do you know? Because you're just a bunch of uneducated backwoods hicks. So to counter that Old Light criticism that they were uneducated, the New Light groups began establishing colleges. And these are some of the ones that came out of it. Princeton, Brown University, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. Those were all established by the New Lights. Now this was the beginning of what would eventually become known as evangelical Christianity. And this was the beginning of preaching to create a conversion, to convince people that they are horrible sinners, to convince them to throw themselves on the mercy of God. It was also the beginning of a renewed emphasis on how you live your daily life. You should live your daily life keeping in mind that one day you're going to stand before God and give an account. This determined the shape American Christianity would take. As the Great Awakening spread, it drew people away from the established churches, which were the churches of European origin, like Episcopal, Lutheran, Presbyterian. Methodism actually came out of the Great Awakening. It was born during that time. And the Baptists, who had before been a fringe group, readily accepted the New Light theology, and they became less of a fringe group. And so the emphasis here was on your personal religious experience. You need to get emotions from religion. The personal feelings you have are more important than any kind of doctrines handed down from some church over in Europe. And the official churches, with their official doctrines, were no longer seen as having a monopoly on Christianity. Estimates are that 2/3 of the population of colonial America were affected by this. Wealthier people and those who had been here longer tended to be less affected. It was a movement of people who were among the poorer classes. And in the social sphere, it is said that the Great Awakening contributed to the mindset that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. In breaking from the leadership and the domination of the established churches in Europe, it is seen as the first step of the breaking of the American colonies from Great Britain. It was a demonstration of people declaring themselves independent of a foreign established authority. And it represented the energizing of common people. It was common people breaking away from the old way of being ruled by an elite. And it represented sort of a leveling, because it didn't matter if you were an elite of society or not. According to New Light theology, you were still a horrible sinner. It paved the way for the American Revolution in that it was a rejection of rule by an established elite. To a great extent, the Great Awakening created the conditions that made American independence possible. But it sort of became a casualty of its own success as people began to be preoccupied with their grievances with England, and they began to be preoccupied with the American Revolution and the first years in establishing America as its own nation. The fires sort of began to die out. But about 20 years after the American Revolution, the fires would start up again to the Great Awakening, and this was called the second one. The second Great Awakening was characterized again by fiery emotional preaching, by revival meetings and camp meetings. That's when camp meetings came into being. Used to, back years ago, my uncle had a place on Lake Norman, and when we'd go up there, you'd go through somewhere to get to his house, and you'd go by an old Methodist camp meeting place where they had like little shacks out there like the Methodists used to come there. I'm talking about in the 1960s. I don't know if they still went there then, but you could see the remnants of it. But that was the birth of the camp meetings. And that was also the time when Americans started pushing west on the frontier. And these fiery preachers went west with the pioneers. And so there were significant differences back then. By that time, the Methodists had more or less established themselves. The Baptists were no longer seen as fringe groups, and it was the Baptists and Methodists that took up the fire of the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening was characterized by one other thing, what's called post-millennialist belief. And that's the belief that before the second coming of Jesus, there will be a 1,000-year period of peace and happiness on earth. And then after that, they believe Jesus will return and the world will end. And so in addition to saving souls, now they had another goal. They wanted to purify society and prepare for the millennium that would happen 1,000 years before the return of Jesus. And the idea began that Christians, if they wanted to, could work hard and achieve an ideal society on earth. It was that kind of thinking that eventually led to the abolitionist movement for slavery. It eventually led to what's called the Progressive Era after the Civil War at the turn of the century, which was an era of social, political, and economic reform. And it paved the way then in the early 20th century for what's called the social gospel movement. So you see, everything came out of these awakenings. It was during the Great Awakening that church membership soared in the United States, especially among the Baptists and Methodists, and the Baptists and Methodists finally became the major players in American Christianity. That's when it happened. There was also another result of the Second Great Awakening. It appealed mainly to women. Remember, the first one appealed mainly to young people. The Second Great Awakening appealed mainly to women, with the result that American Christianity would become influenced more by women than men, even though it would be over 100 years before women could hold offices in those church groups. The Second Great Awakening emphasized femininity, and that would have enormous implications for Christianity in our lifetime. It has enormous implications. What American Christianity is today is the result of the road it took to get to where it is today. What you see at the handful of Baptist churches around here that have the stage performance services is a result of the Second Great Awakening and the First Great Awakening. As a result, it's emotion. It's appeal to emotion. It's also feminine. That's feminine. That kind of service is feminine, and that is a result of the feminist influence in the Second Great Awakening. But anyway, that's the road that leads to that, and it's a road that leads to Baptists and Methodists being the majority religion here. It's a road that leads to American Christianity taking the unique road that it took of all the forms of Christianity that have ever existed. The time period of the mid-1700s through the mid-1800s was the time when that road was constructed. And we have been going down that road ever since. It was the time the ball started rolling to things that are today. I find the history of things like that fascinating. Maybe I'm more of a student of Christianity and what's going on today than most people are, but I really do believe that in order to understand today, you have to understand the road that led to it.